Hi, I'm the Highlander, and welcome to this video. Thanks for watching, by the way. Recently, we've seen the release of Super Mario Bros. 64, a port of the NES version of Super Mario Bros., but on the Commodore 64. Now, the Commodore 64 is actually a logical platform to base a port on, because the NES and the Commodore 64 share the same family of CPU. They're both based on the 6502. But there are vast differences between the NES and the Commodore 64. The NES is is faster. It has a different graphical chip and a different audio chip. All with different capabilities and different characteristics. But still, it's taken until 2019 for a port to actually be made. I think the port got a lot of attention. It sparked a lot of attention in the original game as well, and all its ways of emulating it. But perhaps it got more attention because 4 days after its release, there were already rumors that NES had already taken or were about to take action to stop the distribution of this free copy of the game. Now, of course, not everybody understands. I see it as I see the port as a great tribute to the original game. But here's Nintendo again trying to protect their intellectual property. That's the way it works, I guess. You can still find a copy of the game. It's distributed on the usual sites, like CSDB is a very well-known one, but there are others. And you will probably be able to locate a copy of this game and run it on your Commodore 64. Now, this video is not about the game, but it is about the person who made it. I was interested in this person and knowing a little bit more about them. I have not been in touch with them. I have not had any contact with them. But all I knew is that they were called Zeropaige. Zeropaige with P-A-I-G-E, which refers to the Commodore 64's zero page, which is the first part of memory, which holds many important registers and things, variables. But beyond that, I didn't know anything about the person, so I thought I'd do a little search and try and find out a little bit more about the game, the way it was developed, and this video is about what I found. Now, I wrote some things down because I don't have everything in my head, of course. Most of what I found about Zeropaige, first off, a person who calls themselves Page in that way is most likely to be a woman, a girl, so I'm going to say she. Zeropaige, if you watch this and you're not a she, then I'm sorry, but that's just the assumption I'm going to make here. Most of the things that I found were on the Lemon 64 forum. Lemon 64 forum is all about Commodore 64. It's about games. It's about technical discussions. It's about new releases, work in progress. If you want to make a Commodore 64 game, you are wise to post your work as a work in progress there, because most of it is posted there. There is one post where someone asked, has there ever been a port of Super Mario Brothers, I have to get my text right, on the Commodore 64? Now, this post generated some answers by people who said, well, there's been the Great Gianna Sisters, there have been some sprite hacks, but not a real port. And basically, the discussion was going into this direction where people were talking about things that were like a port, but weren't really a port. And along comes Paige, who posts a little bit like Linus did when he made his first Linux post. She said like, "Oh, okay, I'm working on this port, and blah blah blah." And basically, in the first few answers after that, nobody really responded. But I've gone. It's the thread by now is quite long. It's like 65 pages or something, and I went through all of the pages and read most of the stuff that's there. And gradually, you see Paige posting more and more details and updates, and people are cottoning on to, hey, here's someone who's actually trying, and it may be she has a chance of actually doing something. And like most projects that start, they also stop in a thread, after a few months or maybe a few years. The project just ends, and I've been in that boat quite often. But Paige kept on working, and sometimes with only a few posts in a year, the updates and screenshots, they kept happening. So I thought it was a pretty interesting read. Although it's a lot of technical discussions as well. Most of the people who are there know about how to handle sprites and multiplexers and joysticks and all that. But reading through everything, you can sort of get a feel for how the progress was made. Now, to make it very clear, Paige didn't write the code from scratch. I think it was in 2012, but I'm not entirely sure about that. There's a person calls himself Doppelganger who made a disassembly of the original code of the Super Mario Brothers kart. Now, this project in itself was not something that this Doppelganger takes sole credit for, because there were a lot of people involved in disassembling that code. A disassembly is technically easy, but you have no semantics at all. So most of the work that goes into making a disassembly meaningful is adding meaning to the numbers that you get. And there you need a lot of knowledge about the NES hardware platform, because you can, match registers to certain functions and start naming things in that way, and then you have to glean the meaning out of the code to see, oh, this is about the player, and this is about the enemies, and this is about the drawing the field and whatever. So, but this code was and still is published on GitHub, and you can still download it, and it's the original disassembly of the code, and that's where Paige started to make her version. There are, by the way, other people who are also working on ports or working on versions, and they all start from that code because it has all the logic and basically it has everything in it. But to make it run on a different platform, you have to go through everything and either rewrite it because the hardware that it is addressing isn't available on your platform. Like the NES has the APU for audio and has the PPU for video, and they work completely different from the SID and the VIC chip in the Commodore 64. So you have to go through all the sprite code, all the movement code, all the screen mapping code, and you have to rewrite it, basically, which is what Paige has done. But there's one guy, Enthusi, that's his username on Lemon64, who's also working on something. I didn't follow that progress, but there may be something in the works yet, one of the things that are probably important, this is as I said, there's a lot of technical details in making the port. One of the techniques to use on the Commodore 64, I mean, as you can see behind me, the game does scrolling. It does horizontal scrolling mostly. Now, doing a horizontal scroll on a Commodore 64 is perfectly possible, but it takes a lot of compute cycles. And working on an already speed-challenged system to make this port, you want to, the scrolling to cost as little as possible. So there are techniques, there are glitches in the VIC that can be used. the technique is used as HSP or VSP. It's short for virtual screen positioning, or maybe vertical screen positioning. It's a way of scrolling the screen without having the CPU do anything. It's just making use of a glitch in the VIC that will cause the scrolling to happen. So Super Mario Bros. 64 uses VSP to do the scrolling so that as little time as possible is spent by the CPU doing the actual scrolling. I've done some experiments with horizontal scrolling as well. And yeah, there's a lot of timing and there's a lot of work that goes into doing that. It is also known that VSP crashes on some machines because you're not using a documented feature. You're using a glitch, and I think there's a piece of software that tests whether your system can or will crash using VSP. But I have read some people's posts saying that Super Mario Brothers crashes on their system or blocks or whatever. So, and it's most likely to be caused by this use of VSP. Also, there's a lot of posts on Forum 64 by Paige about rewriting the APU emulator. She wrote her own APU emulator, which is to say that she made her own way of recreating the sound and the music and the sound effects, which I mean is an effort and a half in itself. Some routine, some stuff that happens in the game, like you can walk over a bridge and the bridge will be removed, and there are the swings that have to be animated, axes that have to be rotated, and all that. That caused a lot of work, I suppose, because some of the things that are used, like one of the things that the PPU in the NES can do is to flip and to mirror sprites. The VIC-2 has no such capability, so yeah, you have to find a different way. And an easy way is just to add more sprites and to choose another form. But you're also limited in the amount of data that you have available, so you can't just add sprites for everything. So she found some clever ways around some problems. Of course, the technicalities we'll never know, because she is not about to share the code. So for all of you who were hoping that she might put it up on GitHub, she said no, because I don't want others to basically make products based on my code. If you want to make something, then you can start with the same disassembly that Doppelganger made, and which is still available and has been available for years. One of the interesting things that I thought was nice to hear is that the NES version has only 256 pixels horizontally. The Commodore 64 has more, which causes a problem because, well, sprite positioning, you have to basically have a 9-bit X coordinate, because with 8 bits you can't get up to, or you can't get beyond 256 pixels. The NES didn't have that problem, but the Commodore does. Now, the Commodore version, which is not this one, the Commodore version does show more than the original 256 bits horizontally, and stuff happens outside the visual range for the NES. So the game actually, the original code does less checks in that region. And as you can see, some people have also said that you can actually see sprites appear out of nothing on the right side of the screen, which would never happen on the NES because you don't see it. But basically, it's happening. Also, a lot of time went into detecting the platform that the game is running on, enabling a faster machines like the machines fitted with a super CPU or the Commodore 128 or the DTV. All of the other platforms are detected. One of the things that that plays a role in that is detecting whether you're running on an NTSC or a PAL machine. The most likely way of arranging timing on a Commodore 64 is just waiting for the raster to draw the screen and then sync your code to that. She doesn't do that. She uses timing, like she just measures time, and that enables her to, she says somewhere in her post that it's probably better to run a PAL version of the game on an NTSC system. I'm not quite sure how that works, because the detector would detect whatever you have, but she does use a sort of a timing that is independent of where the raster is drawing. So that's actually quite clever, and it probably saves her some time as well. It is worthy to note that the game was meant to be playable and runnable on a stock Commodore 64. No CPU enhancements or turbos or whatever. It's true that you run into slowdowns and the music slows down so that you know that there is slowdown and you can adjust your gameplay to that. But that is what is meant to run on. It's also meant to run with a single button, like up is jump and the button is fire or whatever. Now, this is quite interesting because I didn't know this just from running the game, but there are also 2-button joysticks for the Commodore 64 and ways of detecting that. Now, Super Mario Bros. Does detect a second jump button. Now, it doesn't require it, which is important to know, but it does detect it. One of the things that you would need a second button for is to do the duck jump. So you jump and you press a button and you pounce on the block that is below you. Now, that isn't exactly necessary to play the game unless you want to get into the minus level. There's one location where you do one of those duck jumps and you end up in a place where you can go down a pipe and you come to world -1, which is an underwater level that basically never ends. That level is in the game, but you need a second button to get down there. So that's, this is all what I got from the forum. I'm not sure if it actually ended up in the final game, but it's worth testing. So anyone who has a 2-button joystick, and I don't mean like a regular Competition Pro, because yes, that has 2 buttons, but they're wired to be 1 button, but actually 2 different buttons. Someone can test that and get into the miners world and see if it works. Let's see. Okay. One of the things that the NES has, with the PPU has, basically it has a hardware multiplexer. The Commodore 64 is limited to 8 sprites, basically showing 8 sprites on one scan line. There are ways around it, but you'd have to multiplex. You'd have to, when the sprites are drawn, switch the sprite definitions and then draw the sprites again. But there'll be different sprites, and to the human eye within one frame that will appear like more than 8 sprites, but it will just be the original 8 sprites, just reworked. That all has to be done in software. The PPU in the NES has a hardware multiplexer, basically. It allows you more sprites. So that is something that's also had to go into the game. Another technical note, I find it interesting, maybe you will as well. The APU is emulated. She says that it takes 18 scan lines. To give you some sort of a measure of what 18 scan lines mean, is that each scan line takes 63 clock cycles. So times 18 do the math. It's quite a lot of time. 18 scan. One character is 8 scan lines high, so this is already almost 3 scan lines. 3 characters high. It's quite a lot of time to emulate sound only. So that sort of gives an indication of how much of a struggle it was to fit everything into the Commodore 64. So not so much writing the game code, but making it fit. I imagine that doing this port was much like reading through the code, finding the routines, identifying what they were doing, and then asking, like, how can this run on the Commodore 64? Can it run just like that? Or, all the hardware-based routines would have to be looked at, and then you'd have to test a lot and see if everything works as expected, sounds as expected, and all that. Another thing that I thought was interesting is that she asked for suggestions of how to name the game, and in a way that it would not confuse people into thinking it was Super Mario Bros. 64 for the Nintendo 64. And a lot of suggestions actually came. One of the most funny ones I thought was Super Commodore Brothers. I could have made it, but it didn't. So she actually just stuck with Super Mario Bros. 64. And it does confuse a lot of people into thinking that it might be for the Nintendo 64. Although we now know it isn't. Also, one of the things that she voiced in 2016 was the worry that the release of Sam's Journey would come either just before or just after the release of Super Mario Bros. 64, and that it might take away some of the interest from the Super Mario release. Well, in the end, it didn't, and because Sam's Journey came out, I think, in 2017, a lot sooner, and it was a commercial release, and I think both games, although both technically very impressive, were and still are in a very different ballpark, and sadly, Super Mario Brothers probably got more attention right just after the release from Nintendo taking action against it, and it got in the news. It's got in mainstream news. So that's something that Sam's Journey didn't get. Although Sam's Journey is a very impressive game. Also, what I learned from reading the posts is that there is some keyboard support for pausing the game and sending you back to the title screen, something which I hadn't discovered yet. So, again, something that is left to test. So that is all I could find about Zeropaige. So I've considered sending a request for an interview or something. I'd have to think of a list of interesting questions. I hope you found this interesting, at least. I've learned some new things this morning about Super Mario Brothers and its maker. The post on the Lemon 64 forum you can just still find. It is quite a long read, but interesting. And it was called Has There Ever Been a Port for the Commodore 64? So read your way through that. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.